Well, the most important thing to know is that if you look at the past 2,000 years of world history, for 1800 out of the past 2,000 years, in 1800 out of the past 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and then North America took off. But the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. It's been abnormal because many in the world can see what the Western media cannot see, which is that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And people can feel it in their guts. They know that this is what is happening. But at the same time, even though that the arrival of the Asian century is the biggest thing that is happening in the world, you will never find the word Asian century anywhere in the Western media. And that's quite remarkable, because when you consider that the Western media prides itself on being honest, open-minded, objective, impartial, neutral, right? They say we use evidence-based approaches to understand the world. Amazing, right? They use all the best scientific tools and they cannot see the biggest thing that is happening in the world, which is actually quite shocking. It is shocking that this is the biggest thing that is happening in the world and the most powerful media cannot see it happening. So therefore, what I propose to do in my remarks today is to leave with you three big ideas which in some way or another possibly explain the success of the book. The first big idea, and I'll say a little bit about that, is that the Asian century is real. It is happening, even though the Western media doesn't report it. The second big idea is that there are structural reasons why the West is refusing to accept the idea of the Asian century. And I'll explain the structural reasons. And at the same time, the third big idea I want to leave with you is that Asians should not be complacent. Even though the Asian century is real, there are challenges, there are problems, and the Asian growth and development can be derailed if we are not careful. So these are the three big ideas. And I'll speak for about 10, 15 minutes, and then I understand we'll have a Q&A session. So why is the Asian century happening? And there are many reasons for it. And the first and the most obvious reason why the Asian century is happening is that it is a perfectly natural development. Now, what do I mean by as a natural development? Well, the most important thing to know is that if you look at the past 2,000 years of world history, for 1800 out of the past 2,000 years, in 1800 out of the past 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and then North America took off. But the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. It's been abnormal. So what we are seeing in the 21st century is the exit of the abnormal and the return of the normal, where China, India, and the other Asian countries are once again emerging as the largest economies in the world. And by the way, this is all a result of the fact that for most of human history, Asian societies performed on par with European societies We were on par. And then, of course, something magical happened in the West. They had the Renaissance, they had the Enlightenment, other developments, and the West leapt ahead of the rest of the world. And after leaping ahead, conquered the whole world. Even this city, Beijing, 120 years ago, was ravaged by forces from the West. Incredible treasures of Beijing destroyed by Western soldiers. That was Western power at its peak over 100 years ago. But that's the past. And now we're back. Asians are back. And Asians, as you know, make up the majority of the world's population, 55%. And if we perform on par, we will have the largest economies in the world. So that's one reason, is a return to normal. But the other reason is that the Asian societies have also learned from the West how to succeed. And I actually wrote a whole book on it called The New Asian Hemisphere, and published in 2008 in the year of the Beijing Olympics, explaining how Asian societies have succeeded by having understood, absorbed, and implemented 7 pillars of Western wisdom. Ideas like free market economics, mastery of science and technology, rule of law. So all these things we have learned and we are implementing. And something that is absolutely strange that is happening in the world today, which is again underreported, is that while the Asian societies are embracing some of the successful Western ideas, the West is walking away from its own successful ideas. Now, this is not an exaggeration. Just to give you a simple, I mentioned how mastery of free market economics is why Asian societies are succeeding. And one thing the United States always used to say, I remember in the 1980s when I was in the United States, I spent almost a decade there. And they said, we must open up our economies, liberalize, sign free trade agreements, right? And the United States was pushing for free trade agreements in the 1980s. But today, the US Congress cannot pass a single free trade agreement. Free trade is dead in the US, and the world's largest free trade agreements are being signed here in East Asia. And in January 2022, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, launched by the 10 ASEAN countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, took off, right? And that's an example of how things are changing, right? The world's largest free trade agreements should have been created in the West, but they can't. And now Asians are doing so. And this is, of course, true in many areas. For example, I mean, a very simple thing. When you come to China, always stuns you is the infrastructure. Now, as you know, in theory, China is the number 2 power and United States is the number 1 power, right? And so in theory, the number 1 power should have the best infrastructure in the world. But amazingly, if you want to see first world airports, come to Asia. Beijing has got 2 first world airports. Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, even Delhi, Mumbai have amazing airports. But if you want to see third world airports, you go to United States. John F. Kennedy Airport is a nightmare, right? It's a nightmare. And there are many airports like that. And even President Joe Biden has said, how is it that the United States of America, the most advanced country in the world, doesn't have a single airport in the top 25 airports in the world? Amazing. So these are examples of how things are changing and how power and growth are shifting to Asia. And the thing that's important here is that most of the world can see this, stand that this is real, right? They can see the data. I mean, just for a simple example, in the year nominal market terms, the US economy was 8 times the size of China's economy, right? Now it's only 1.5, 1.3 times bigger, right? That's how fast China has. But other parts of Asia have also grown. Another statistic, if you look at the ASEAN countries, 10 ASEAN countries. In the year 2000, compared with Japan, because Japan was then the second largest economy in the world in the year 2000. Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN. Today, Japan's economy is only 1.5 times bigger than ASEAN. And around 2030, ASEAN will become bigger than Japan. Isn't that amazing? Right? Amazing. And if you look at the trades, the world's largest trade flows are also coming from Asia. Right? So you can see, and I can give you data on that too, how all this is showing the shift of power to Asia. And it's very clear. I must emphasize that we still have 77 years left in the Asian century. And it's a lot is going to happen over the next 77 years. And this is what this book does. It provides you a glimpse into that future that is coming. So that's the first big idea, that the Asian century is real. The second big idea I want to leave with you is to explain to you the structural reasons why the West is reluctant to accept the idea of the Asian century. And the structural reasons are a result of the fact that because of the past 200 years of Western domination of world history, the West occupies a lot of geopolitical space in the world. It controls many important organizations, and it doesn't want to give up its control. Even though this control is a result of them having a lot of power 100 years, 50 years ago, the power has diminished. They should control. They don't want to. They want to maintain control. And comes from the two most important economic organizations in the world, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these were created after World War II. At that time, as you know, and this was an incredible achievement by the United States. The United States in 1950, soon after World War II, with 5% of the world's population, had a 50% share of global GNP. That's how powerful the United States was. But that was unnatural, as I said. And now the US has come down. It's still the number one economy. It maybe has 20% of the world's GNP, but not 50% anymore, right? And clearly, power has shifted, right? But despite the fact that power has shifted, you still have a rule in the IMF that says to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And even though the most dynamic, successful economies in the world are Asian economies, no Asian citizen can run either the IMF or the World Bank. And I can tell you, by the way, it's an important historical fact. In the year 2009, at the height of the global financial crisis, when the West was in deep trouble, they agreed that, okay, we'll no longer dominate the IMF and the World Bank. Future heads of the IMF and World Bank will be selected on merit and not on the basis of geography. They made that commitment in 2009. 14 years have gone by. They have not fulfilled that commitment. They are still controlling this organization. And the way they do it, by the way, so you understand, is that in the IMF especially, a country's share of voting power should represent its share of the global economy, right? But I can tell you, as recently as 10 years ago, 3 small states, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, had a greater voting share than China in IMF. Shocking. But even today, now China's share of the global GNP maybe is 16, 17, maybe 18%. You can check. But China's share of IMF voting shares is only 6%. It should not be 6%. It should be 16, 17%. But I can tell you, the West will resist the change because they don't want to give up the power. And I can tell you, the IMF will have a real problem when China becomes the number one in the world, because as Christine Lagarde, when she was head of the IMF, she said, in the constitution of the IMF, it says that the headquarters of IMF shall always be in the capital of the largest economy in the world. That's why it's in Washington, D.C. But when China becomes the world's largest economy, and if the IMF tries to leave Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. will explode, right? Now, I'm giving you this as examples for structural reasons why the West doesn't want to accept the Asian century. Because if they accept that this is an Asian century, they have to learn to share power with the rest of the world, right? And they don't want to. People get used to the power. There's always a huge time lag. And the Western media also continues to pretend that the Asian century is not happening. It's related to that structural reason. So that's the second big idea I want to leave with you. The third big idea I want to leave with you is we in Asia, at the same time, should not be complacent. We still have a long way to go in our development. We have done very well, succeeded very well, but we got to be careful because there can be threats and there can be difficulties in our growth and development. So I can tell you, for example, the biggest danger to growth and development in Asia is war. Because to develop, you must have peace. And if there's no peace, you can't develop. And so far, touch wood, it's amazing, right? That since the end of the Cold War in 1990, the guns have been silent in Asia. That's quite remarkable, by the way, because when the Cold War ended, you will find in this book, Asian 21st Century, I cite some Americans who say that Europe's past, Europe had the biggest wars in the past, World War I, World War II, and will be Asia's future. So at the end of the Cold War, everyone thought the wars would happen in Asia and Europe would be in peace. Now we know, right? 33 years after the end of the Cold War, Asia has been at peace and Europe has been at war. You had the Yugoslav wars, now you have this massive Ukraine war. As I again say in an essay in this book, wars are the result of geopolitical incompetence. And one idea that the Europeans refuse to accept is that the Ukraine war could have been prevented. All wars can be prevented if you work hard to achieve a political compromise that is acceptable to all the parties. And an imperfect political compromise that delivers peace is better than a perfect war which only destroys. And the war in Ukraine has been remarkably destructive, right? And even though the West says that the whole world is supporting the West in this Ukraine war, that's not true. It's true that over 140 countries voted in favor of the UNGA resolution condemning the war in Ukraine. And it's right, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. So under international law, countries have to criticize it. But when the West imposed sanctions on Russia, 85% of the world's population did not impose sanctions on Russia. So 85% of the world's population didn't agree with the West that only Russia is to blame for this war in Ukraine. So you see how the West in some ways has isolated itself from the rest of the world. But it's important for us in Asia to learn a big lesson from the Ukraine war and make sure that nothing similar to Ukraine war happens in our region. And here I can tell you that one organization that is genuinely underappreciated by everybody in the world, and even sadly underappreciated in Asia, is ASEAN. Because one of the key reasons why East Asia is at peace is because of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And that's why I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. Because ASEAN has the one organization. It is a very weak organization. But because it is so weak, everybody trusts it. It's the only organization that can invite United States, Russia, China, Japan, South Korea, European Union to come for meetings. The convening power of ASEAN is phenomenal. But by bringing the countries together, they have also helped to improve relations and sometimes maybe even have prevented wars. I can tell you in the late 1990s, when there was a quarrel between China and Japan and leaders couldn't talk to each other bilaterally, they came to an ASEAN meeting and then they talked to each other. And that's what ASEAN does, right? And ASEAN is underappreciated. So therefore, just because we have achieved peace over the last, as I said, 33 years, we should not be complacent. We should ensure that this doesn't happen in the region. So we have to continue working hard, both domestically as well as internationally, to preserve peace in the region. But I'm going to conclude with just one last statistic, because this statistic, I hope, will explain why I continue to remain optimistic for the future of Asia, and why, in fact, this statistic alone can explain why the Asian century will happen. Now, as you know, if you look at it, I want to focus on three fast-growing parts of Asia, what I call the new CIA. Now, CIA doesn't stand for Central Intelligence Agency. CIA stands for China, India, and ASEAN. And this makes up almost 40% of the world's population, because if you add the 1.4 billion people in China, 1.4 billion people in India, almost 700 million people in ASEAN, you get 3.5 billion people. Now, out of 3.5 billion people in this CIA countries, in the year 2000, when the 21st century began, in the year 2000, the total middle class population was only 150 million. Only 150 million out of 3.5 billion in middle class. But by 2020, 3 years ago, times to 1.5 billion people. And by 2030, that number may be 2.5 to 3 billion people. Now, just look at that. Asia has now produced the world's largest middle-class population, which also means that the world's largest markets will now be in Asia. And this will be where people will come, to seek growth and development. So it is statistics like this that explain why the rest of the world understands that the Asian's happening, and why the West still accept that the Asian century is happening. Thank you very much.
What do you guys think? Is he right about Asia is the next global leaders? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.